You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 402 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering impeachment, how some of the rules of the game are changing in the Middle East, and the U.S. ramping up airstrikes in Libya. Need you all to either share the show or recommend it to somebody. You do that at the libertarianinstitute.org, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage there. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it. The show comes out 3 days a week and updates current events, so the way you get the most of the show is by subscribing to it. And last, if you want to become a donor to the show and get in on the monthly live streams, you do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Donate $5 a month. The September live stream is the 30th, so that's Monday, the date this show is airing, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you either could come join the live stream and chat with me, or post some questions either at Patreon or in the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. All right, so first up on this impeachment, if you want a, hour-long, great, comprehensive breakdown of it, Jimmy Dore actually has a fantastic interview with Aaron Mate on it. And, I know Jimmy Dore is a comedian, so sometimes if you're just looking for a detailed breakdown of what happened, that, isn't always the best source because he's, making jokes and other stuff. But in this case, he just interviews Aaron for about an hour, all the little different avenues, how this starts to weave in a little bit with Russiagate and the comparisons that you can make there. So I'll link to that in the show notes page if people are interested. But for a little bit of a shorter breakdown, last week or so, we become familiar with a whistleblower complaint against Donald Trump, alleging that he pushed the Ukrainian president to investigate Joe Biden and his son for corruption and leveraged U.S. aid with Ukraine, for that. So if the U.S. was going to release, I believe, $250 million of military aid to Ukraine, then the Ukrainian president would have to investigate Joe Biden. Now, obviously, if this, is the story, there are issues here. Donald Trump, is Joe Biden's his political rival. And so, him using state funds to leverage something against a different head of state in order to try to get dirt on his enemy seems somewhat unfair. But, in the general scheme of crimes committed by Trump and other U.S. presidents, it's still a pretty low bar and something that happens pretty common. Again, as I mentioned on the last show, if you want to impeach Trump, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, there's so many different things going on here. Even people bring up the detention of the migrant children. I think that's a far better cause for impeaching Trump than this Ukraine nonsense. But then we have the transcript of the call come out, and it pretty quickly sheds light to show that what was alleged in the whistleblower complaint didn't actually happen. And then we also find out that the whistleblower complaint itself, whistleblower actually wasn't in the room for the conversation. So Trump did talk to the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and in that call, he, I believe, mentioned Barr and Giuliani as possible contacts for Ukraine for information about investigating Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. But there was obviously, no quid pro quo in what Trump said, and Trump has maintained that he is looking not to give this foreign aid to Ukraine because he believes other European countries should pick up the tab. Now, there's two things to that. One, it's convenient, and two, it's probably a little bit true at the same time. Trump has repeatedly called on European allies to pick up the tab more on NATO and other kinds of defense and military-related spending. So it doesn't surprise me at all that this is a Trump position as well. And really the problem with whatever the Democrats are going to try to do, even if he's guilty of the worst, narrative here altogether, I think they're going to have a difficult time proving anything. And so, the whole impeachment proceedings together seem like, more of a show trial than anything to actually get Trump for, where I think if you want to prosecute Trump for violating the Constitution and, not following the war powers that are granted to the House and the Senate and not the presidency, and saying that, we said no to this war in Yemen, the president continues to wage it, that would be something to go after him for, like war crimes in various places, authorizing the raid, in the early days of Yemen that ends up with an American girl dying. Plenty of places to find concrete proof to prosecute Trump here, where this, you're just not going to get it. So with all this that we know, there's a couple of other, issues and places this goes. One is that, Donald Trump is saying, well, Joe Biden pretty much did the same thing. And then there's the corruption allegations against Joe Biden's son. So after Joe Biden worked with the Obama administration, we know that he was one of the people who spearheaded this 2014 regime change in Ukraine. This regime change, orchestrated by the Obama administration, leads to 10,000 plus dead in Ukraine, an ongoing civil war in that country. Russia ends up annexing the Crimean Peninsula after the people of that region of what was for a short time Ukraine, and once again rejoined Russia. So all of these are consequences of that war, or of that regime change that Joe Biden helped push. We know this from the Victoria Nuland call with, I believe, the U.S. ambassador to NATO, basically saying that the EU was taking too long and that we're going to go ahead with this regime change in Ukraine, and also, pointing towards Biden's support. So after that happens, of course, Ukraine, which is a notoriously corrupt country, is open and ripe to more corruption as you have a overthrow and then new regime coming in. One of the energy companies there appoints Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, to their board and pays him $50,000 a month. Now, everybody notes that Hunter Biden's career is a legacy of failure and drug addiction. He also has no experience in Ukraine and no experience in gas. And so, it seems like at very best, the appointment of Hunter Biden to this board is an attempt to, make a contact with the vice president, and, therefore is just more or less pay for play, kind of crony capitalism as a way when the U.S. starts distributing aid to Ukraine to get, the biggest chunk of the pie they can and get, their favorable politicians and different laws passed, that they want. And it works, this is directly that. And Hunter Biden said, yeah, give me the job and I'll talk to my dad about your company. And, doesn't it help knowing the vice president's son? So after the coup and a new government gets set up, and again, Ukraine notoriously corrupt even before the coup, but I'm sure it gets worse after. Ends up with having a couple ongoing investigations, and one of those investigations is into the company that Hunter Biden is on the board of, and being investigated for corruption. And then you have Joe Biden go to Ukraine, threaten to withhold, I believe, $1 billion in some kind of loans or aid to Ukraine unless that prosecutor was fired. And as Joe Biden brags about, that prosecutor ends up getting fired. So it seems very possible that, one, Joe Biden's son is very corrupt and, should be indicted for some kind of corruption here. And two, whatever Joe Biden did is, I think, probably a step worse than what Donald Trump did. It's one thing, I guess, for Trump to try to get Joe Biden prosecuted and, Hunter Biden prosecuted in Ukraine for crimes they committed. And while that would benefit him politically, it's one thing. But Biden, got somebody, official in another country fired who was investigating his son. That seems, a lot deeper of a kind of corruption to me. I'll link to the article in The Hill by John Solomon where he releases a lot of the details here, because previously people had thought that the case against Hunter Biden was dropped prior to Joe Biden demanding the prosecutor step down. And so then, that whole thing seems a little bit less fishy. And in fact, if the case against Hunter had already been dropped, when that suggests that Joe Biden was firing this guy for reasons other than the corruption, since the guy did what he wanted. But that's not true. The investigation was open. And that's what John Solomon exposes. The last note I want to make here is this all originates from the whistleblower complaint from somebody who wasn't in the room at the time of the call between Trump and Zelensky, sparking off all this controversy. And I just want to say, this has been pointed out by a couple people, Michael Tracy, I believe Ray McGovern, in saying that calling this person a whistleblower is, probably technically true, but is far different than the kind of whistleblower that Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden is, where this person, remaining anonymous, is within the intelligence agency, possibly a holdover from the Brennan times. And as I've documented very well on the show, especially on the episodes I've done with Joanne Leone, the corruption and John Brennan's crusade against Donald Trump. And so would, I imagine, be possible that some Brennan holdovers may still be working against Donald Trump. And, for this whistleblower, it's all just hearsay. It's nothing that person actually heard or knew about. It's not exposing any actual crime, but just sparking another fake scandal. Now, maybe the whistleblower is actually a Trump fan, because the way I see this playing out is probably better for the president than is the Democrats. At the end of the day, they're not going to be able to get him on this. His presidency, for most part, I don't think has, been as spectacular as he claims. And so the more excuses he has for not doing a good job, the better for him. And so, if, this entire next year is taken up by debate around this impeachment stuff. And as I explained, it seems, for now that Joe Biden, and so that means since he's riding on the Obama legacy, Obama and the, kind of the entire Democratic Party, as he is the front runner, are on the hook for being more corrupt in Ukraine than Donald Trump is. And it's, I think, going to look overall better for him at the end of this. All right, I want to talk about some things in the Middle East, and this is in a lot of ways, speaking about the Houthi attack on the Saudi oil installations a few weeks ago, causing what they said 5% of the global oil supply to be shut down, half of Saudi's output, just a lot of problems for the kingdom, and really shook up oil prices, and, was just obviously a big global deal. Now, again, we still don't have any evidence as far as who was behind this attack. The Houthis claim responsibility, and they've been at war with Saudi Arabia since Saudi started the war against them 4.5 years ago. So it seems very possible to me that the Houthis did carry out that attack. And Nasser Arabi has suggested that there may have been some help from within Saudi Arabia to help carry out that attack, possibly explaining why the targets were so accurately hit, which is the big contention that the Houthis didn't do it, is, the attack was too precise. But at the end of the day, the kind of important thing, and this is a point made, I've heard from David Stotman, Con Hallinan, the Moon of Alabama blog, is that the U.S. doesn't and can't prove, at least publicly, where the attacks came from. It doesn't seem like it was caught on radar. And all the defense systems, the missile defense systems and the air defense systems that Saudi has, which for the most part is the best systems made by the U.S., failed and were unable to prevent or detect the weapons that were used. That is because these were low-flying and maneuverable cruise missiles and drones. Low drones that I guess probably are kamikaze types that crash into their target. And with these abilities to hit the Saudi targets, it shows that the rules of the game have changed in the Middle East, that the U.S. and the Saudis and our, Western allies don't have the technology to stop these cruise missiles and drones. And that means that U.S. assets, oil infrastructure, desalinization plants, Israeli targets are all on the radar should the U.S. or our allies push too far. Now, obviously, the U.S. Economic war against Iran is still going on. So it's not that the whole playbook in the past is thrown out and Iran is now dominant. The U.S. is still the world empire, but, it could only push so far. Donald Trump, I think has maybe realized that he can't carry out an attack against Iran. Now, I don't think that means that he understands that he needs diplomacy, to figure out the situation with Iran. I think he thinks he is still use sanctions and economic warfare. But I think he has figured out that, actual war gained into shooting and lobbing missiles across the Persian Gulf at Iran isn't going to be a great idea for the United States. And our, the U.S. and our forces stationed in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE are all going to be really at risk as well as, the global economy and, destroying Saudi's oil infrastructure, as well as I'm sure they're going to target Iranian oil infrastructure, in, different assets of different American allies across the region. More and more people are, starting to predict and saying, and I guess the only reason I'm not 100% on board is that the Saudis are going to have to deal with the Houthis is just because Prince Bonesaw in Saudi Arabia seems pretty kooky and committed to this war. I'm not sure that kid's in his right mind, or if he's not just a really sadistic and evil person or something like that. But he, so maybe he continues this war even when it's obviously going bad and not working well for Saudi Arabia. And, even to the point where they're losing the war and, having their oil infrastructure attacked on a regular basis to keep up that war. But it seems clear that the Saudis, don't have the technology to really counter these cruise missile attacks, and scratch your head on what they could possibly do to stop them, especially if they're coming from Iran. I mean, if they're coming from the Houthis, they could continue to try to bomb Houthi facilities at will. Although, 4.5 years into the war kind of shows that they really can't take out the Houthi missile installations, because even if you are questionable if the Houthis carried out this attack, they've continued to hit Saudi Arabia with ballistic missiles throughout the war. But whether it came from Iran, Iraq, or Yemen, they can't combat it. And if it came from Iran or Iraq, well, what are you going to do? Start, a war with that country as well? And I think the Iranian militias in Iraq and the Iranian army are pretty more formidable even than the Houthis, and could inflict even more damage on Saudi Arabia. Now, the U.S., does have range of options still. They're putting more troops in Saudi Arabia, sending another Patriot missile battery there. Of course, the thing's useless and isn't going to work. It's actually just putting 200 more U.S. troops in harm's way should another war break out. But I guess that's the kind of thing that Trump could do to make it look like he's doing something. I'm sure this is also having an impact on almost kind of separate issue in the way that it's handled in U.S. media, but I'm sure to the Iranians is all the same, and that's the JCPOA. The U.S. getting out of this deal usually gets a mention in articles about, these more hostile tensions with Iran or what's going on in Yemen, but generally it's just a quick line, and, there's no real thoughts about, how could the Houthis or Iran being able to target Saudi infrastructure change kind of negotiating positions when it comes to, changing the nuclear deal or cutting a deal with Iran and getting this economic war over. So the Iranians are continuing to take steps away from the JCPOA. Now they're installing more advanced centrifuges, and I guess these could quickly enrich uranium to higher levels of purity. This doesn't mean Iran is making a bomb, but it's something that they should be able to do, but agreed to limit under the deal. And since the Americans left the deal, that, they're no longer going to participate in it and use more efficient machines. All right, some other things I want to cover. Mike Pompeo has leveled new allegations of chemical weapons use against Bashar al-Assad in Syria, this time saying Assad definitely used chlorine, but maybe even sarin against rebels somewhere in Idlib. Moon of Alabama blog has the best breakdown of this. I'll link to it in the show notes page. But basically, it's really hard to find any chemical weapons allegations against Assad in May, other than one statement made by Pompeo. And, the article there only goes back to the New York Times saying, well, the U.S. says it happens, but, there's no other reporting on it. So, Pompeo coming out a few months later saying, now we've confirmed it without providing any future evidence, makes it seem like he probably hasn't confirmed it. Although, as the Moon of Alabama article, very correctly points out, all these media organizations kind of pick up the line that Pompeo said and now run headlines that Assad is using chemical weapons again. I think the issue with the U.S., our allies, the Kurds, and our NATO allies, the Turks, are going to start to heat up again in northeast Syria. So I just want to kind of quickly what's going on there. The U.S. in the fight against ISIS backed the Syrian YPG, which is mainly just a militia of Syrian Kurds, even though our NATO allies, Turkey, see the Syrian Kurds and the militia, the YPG, as a terrorist organization. The PKK, the Turkish Kurdish militia, is waging an insurgency against the Turkish government on the Turkish side of the border there, of, just the general region of Kurdistan that's in East Turkey, Northeast Syria, North Iraq, West Iran. So Turkey was furious during, the Obama years and then the Trump years that we were supplying weapons to the Syrian Kurds. How dare you arm terrorists? But the U.S. continued to do it anyways. Turkey has pushed for various things. Some of them they have gotten, some of them they haven't. It seems for the most part the U.S. has continued to back our Kurdish allies, even though Turkey has complained. But the recent Turkish demands are that the U.S. establish a very large safe zone along the border between Turkey and Syria east of the Euphrates River. And so this would all be the Syrian Kurdish land. And if the safe zone is, 20 miles wide, I believe at some points would encompass a huge chunk of, Syrian Kurdistan where the population actually lives. Even though they control pretty much all of Syria east of the Euphrates River, I think the Kurds mainly live in the north, up in that region around Kobani. The U.S. has, I guess, so far participated and gone along with the Turkish demands here, and Turkey has said that there is a safe zone set up that's 2 to 3 miles wide and that there's joint patrols going on. But Turkey is now saying the U.S. isn't living up to all of their commitments. And so I guess either they're wanting to expand the safe zone or move some Kurds out of it. Turkey is also saying that they're having a plan to build $27 billion worth of settlements there to resettle Syrians who fled earlier in the war. And I'm guessing that these aren't Syrian Kurds that fled earlier in the war. And so this seems to me to be kind of a attempt to do some ethnic cleansing and repopulation of northeast Syria. I think the Turks would see it more helpful to have a bunch of Sunnis on that border rather than a bunch of Kurds. So I'm concerned that's going to be happening soon and will be back in the news as an issue. Afghanistan had elections over the weekend. I haven't seen any results or anything like that. There was some violence around the election. At the weekly Great Return March protest in Gaza, which happened every Friday, and Gazan protesters was killed by an Israeli sniper. 27 others were injured by live fire. This continues to go on. This time the Reuters article just openly admitted the reason that the Israelis don't grant Palestinians the right to return to their homes that they were kicked out of is because it would then change the Jewish majority in, Israel that they say they need to maintain. It just seems kind of crazy that you have a country that's only a democracy because they don't allow 45% or so of the population to vote. And then, they're just allowed to be kind of styled a Western democracy in the Middle East when, that obviously isn't the case. Last up, U.S. airstrikes in Libya, 3 in southern Libya in the past week. U.S. claims they killed 36 militants. My guess is this is similar to what AFRICOM puts out when they claim to kill people in Somalia. Yeah, we, killed 10 al-Shabaab guys over there. We killed 15 over there. And then somebody actually does some reporting on it, and it turns out there were either civilians killed or it wasn't quite so true that those people were international jihad terrorists. Anyways, it's interesting that, the U.S. is carrying out these strikes in southern Libya, which right now is at least nominally controlled by General Khalifa Haftar, who was a warlord that came in and took over like a half to 2/3 of the country opposed to the U.S. government. And this seems to me a possible sign that the U.S. is actually now okay with, Haftar's alliance here and may be on board with supporting it even. I didn't see the Libyan National Army, that's Haftar's fighting group, protest the strikes, which makes me think that the U.S. targeting militants there was, the types of militants that weren't loyal to Haftar. And if not, even if these were Haftar's forces, it seems then the U.S. would have opened up a whole new battlefield in Libya, this time on behalf of, what we call the UND government, but is really just kind of a government in a box who try to stick in Libya. All right, everybody, that's it. Check out the show at libertarianinstitute.org. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus to get in on the bonus show. Again, doing that tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern.